Around this same time in 2019, I uploaded a video titled, "Is 1440p Still Worth It in 2019?" I received some pretty good feedback on that video, and I wanted to touch on it once again for 2020. Is it worth it? Yeah, it's still worth it a year later, even though I think I possibly could switch back to 1080p or even 720p if that was the only way I could enjoy this hobby we know as video games. Now, going back to dial-up or some crazy crap like that, you must be kidding. 1440p is a pretty big jump over 1080p. Visually, it's a considerable jump, but the extra demand on your hardware is even larger. Visually, it's not quite as good as I thought it would be initially, but I still think it's worth it if you're gaming at 1080p or lower. For those that want to squeeze all of those extra frames in competitive games, you may want to stick with 1080p. I think that's something that's going to vary from person to person, and for me, there's no right or wrong answer. If you're playing games like Counter-Strike, Overwatch, Dota 2, and League of Legends, then GPUs and CPUs in the $150 to especially $600 range are going to obliterate games like that in 1080p as well as 1440p. The difference in games like those at 1080p versus 1440p can be anywhere from 30 FPS all the way to 70 FPS, 80 FPS, and possibly more. I've seen a game like Counter-Strike, just one example, reach an average of 300 FPS, high settings, all the way down to averages of 200 to 250 FPS at 1440p. Again, the games that you're playing are going to matter. If you're playing the latest Assassin's Creed titles or stuff like The Division, Metro Exodus, Red Dead Redemption 2, or one of the latest Tomb Raider titles, you're going to see an even bigger drop-off in performance, and that will also depend on your hardware. But either way, you're going to see a big drop-off in performance compared to some of those games that I mentioned before, your Counter-Strikes and Overwatches of the world. There's a very big difference in games like those versus the AAA stuff where the hardware requirements are a lot more demanding. Some of the major differences can also be decided by a game being more GPU or CPU dependent. Sometimes a game requires a lot of brute force from both. Poor optimization is a thing in gaming. I don't care what anyone says, that's not something you'll probably find in, your Dotas or your League of Legends of the world, but poor optimization is a thing. Don't let someone tell you that your hardware isn't good enough for a lot of the games that you're playing, because that's not always the case. Sometimes developers make really great games with poor optimization. I try to play games with decent to excellent optimization. I love all of those extra frames, but sometimes you're met with a game like, say, Quantum Break. A game that I actually enjoyed, but also had my complaints with. I ended up locking the game at 30 FPS and playing through most of that experience at console settings. If you've spent more on your PC than the Xbox One X is worth, then that's a very serious and unacceptable problem. Thankfully, we have games like Doom and the new Wolfenstein games, updates to the Serious Sam 3 engine that allow for Vulkan support. 1440p is just a really big jump. Some 4Kers may be asking why I went 1440p last year and not 4K. It's the new wave. Everyone's doing it. Actually, no, they're not. In fact, I'd be willing to bet money that most PC gamers are still at 1080p and possibly lower. That's something that you need to consider before switching. I feel those two things are easily the biggest factors or hurdles, if you will. You have to ask yourself, what games am I going to play, and do I have the hardware to push 60 frames or more beyond 1080p? You should ask yourself those questions, because I already know I'm going to get people in the comments section that only watched half the video or skipped around the video asking, I have this CPU from Intel or AMD, I have this $175 GPU or this $300 GPU from NVIDIA or AMD. Is that enough to run 1440p? I can't answer that because I don't know what games you're playing and I don't know the rest of your specifications. I don't know what performance you'd be satisfied with, and I don't know what settings you're willing to sacrifice. Which brings me to my next point. I don't care what resolution you're playing at, if squeezing out as many frames as possible is your biggest concern, then you're gonna need to sacrifice settings in the game. I'm sure I'll also get these liars that come to the video and post in the comment section saying, "What? You're full of it. I have a 2070 or a 2080 Ti in another rig and I max out every game in existence at 1440p and 4K at well over 150 FPS, and you're lying." Sacrifices, unless you're playing much older games, will need to be made at the higher resolutions to get the best performance possible. Going back to something like Counter-Strike on low versus high settings at any resolution, 1440p included, can mean the difference of an average of 280 frames versus 380 frames or 400 frames on low settings. Now, what sacrifices you choose to make and how much of a performance boost you'll get will vary from game to game, but my point still stands. If you're a big single-player, campaign-only, story type of gamer like myself, maybe playing at 60 FPS at 1080p or 1440p is good enough for you. Depending on the game, locking the frame rate to 60 or 100 or 144, getting those really good frame times for an extremely smooth experience is perfectly fine. Believe me, I've done it. I have locked games to a specific frame rate to get those really smooth frame times because I feel that can sometimes make for a better experience. In a first-person game, or what we now call wolfenstein's, even a single-player FPS, it doesn't have to be a competitive game, I try to avoid locking the frame rate in a lot of games like that because everything just feels better in a first-person game more than other genres, especially if you're playing with mouse and keyboard. 1440p delivers a much better image for your money over 1080p. It's very clean, it's very sharp. I was under the impression going into it that 1440p removed all Jaggis from games, and that's not true. Engines matter. The development process matters. This generation especially has seen some awesome improvements to temporal solutions that are so good, even gaming at 1080p delivers little to no Jaggis. But yeah, 1440p is not the Jaggy savior some would have you believe. The higher your resolution, make no mistake, the fewer Jaggis you'll have, sure. But I find in most games I still have to enable some form of anti-aliasing to keep the shimmering down. 1440p will spoil you. I can't lie about that, and you may find it hard to go back for reasons that I just talked about. There's so much extra real estate and room to work with. I knew it would be like that going into 1440p, but I didn't know it was quite this good. If you're a big workflow guy, or gal in this case, and much less of a gamer, a higher resolution is certainly going to give a significant boost in things like streaming and your video editing, and also those of you that do photo editing. Is 1440p still worth it? Was it a great decision in 2019? Absolutely. I wouldn't go back to 1080p unless I suddenly picked up highly competitive gaming where I was competing in tournaments for truckloads of money. The overall image quality in gaming and extra room to work with as a content creator alone has made it more than worth it. Uploading your videos on YouTube in 1440p has its benefits because they allow for a higher bit rate the higher you set your resolution. I will try to answer as many questions as I can in the comment section, but keep some things in mind. I have a pretty nice PC going into this video. I'm rolling with a 3900X, an RTX 2080, 32 gigs of RAM, and what is an all SSD setup. Your PC and my PC may be very different, and I still make sacrifices where necessary to get the best performance. Now, am I making sacrifices in Left 4 Dead 2 or Half-Life 2? No, but those games are still beautiful to me and have aged well enough to turn everything up and just enjoy the experience. Ask yourself, what sacrifices are you willing to make? What are the minimum and recommended requirements of a game, even though those numbers and hardware are not the end-all be-all. Let's make that clear. What games am I playing? What's my workflow like? And how often do I use my PC? Will some of you need to upgrade? Yes, I won't lie to you. I don't know your setup, but some of you will need to upgrade if you want a game at 1440p, if it's something you've been thinking about. But again, that depends on the games and the sacrifices you're willing to make in said games. 1440p is the sweet spot for PC gaming as far as I'm concerned. It will probably be that for years to come before I fully upgrade to 4K and have HDR and 1 millisecond response time, awesome color reproduction, and G-Sync all for around $400 to $600. That would be great. If I could get something like that for around $400 to $600, eventually in the future I'll make that switch to 4K when the hardware available can push 4K and get well over 100 frames in most of the stuff that I'm playing, new and old games. For now, I'll just stick to my Asus ROG that does a good chunk of that and is an amazingly fast TN panel with decent colors. Not amazing, but they're decent. Thank you guys for all the continued support. I do appreciate it. You guys have a good one. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to go back and check out last year's video, you can do that as well. Have a good one. Peace.